Sorry, we're gonna close that window. There we go. We are excited to have Katie with the weather storm that came in. She was unable to drive down, but we are excited to have her here with us virtually. She's with UDVC, as I know Doug braved it and came through, but so yeah, Katie is with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition as the training and outreach coordinator. Is that right, Katie?
Yes.
I'm like, I hope the bell. Thank you. And she is going to be talking to us about empowerment versus over empowerment. And I'm super excited to have her present. So if we're in the room, it'll be muted on our end unless there's a question. Katie, just so you know, like we'll keep our end muted. But then we'll I'll unmute if there's a question or we'll put it in the chat. So
Perfect. That sounds great. Awesome.
so you can take it away.
Thank you. Just heads up, some housekeeping. I am a pretty informal presenter. So I do love to communicate with all of my friends in the audience, whether that's in person or virtually. So there will be some audience participation later in this slide deck. And there we go. So as Vicki said, I'm Katie Schoeles. I'm the Outreach and Training Coordinator here with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. I'm sure all of you know what UDVC does, but just in case, we are an independent, nationally recognized nonprofit coalition working to improve domestic violence intervention and prevention efforts in the state of Utah. We represent victim service providers and shelters across the state who are delivering direct services to domestic violence survivors and their dependents. We're currently partnered with 16 domestic violence service providers throughout Utah. And I am grant funded. So this presentation was supported under my rural grant, which was awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, DOJ. This is my disclaimer that the opinions, findings, conclusions are mine and not necessarily those of OVW. Ooh, words are hard already. Sorry, friends. So that's just a little bit of my housekeeping before we jump right in to the history of overpowerment. And let me get set up real quick. Close that out. Perfect. So as we get started jumping into empowerment versus overpowerment, I thought it was important to look at the history of overpowerment and kind of what that looks like. So historically speaking, we've continuously pushed individuals in domestic violence relationships into the criminal justice system with little regard to whether or not they actually want to participate in the system or not. So in addition to that, the criminal justice system has relied on the victim to make the case, failed to protect victims, lacked specialized investigators and prosecutors, and has had high dismissal rates, low conviction rates, and little accountability for offenders, and has increased the danger for victims in some cases. We know that we have made very big adjustments and improvements to that. But if we look back to the 1980s, when we implemented mandatory prosecution, this happened after county prosecutors were accused of ignoring domestic violence cases. It was claimed that by doing so, we were sending a message that this abuse was criminal. So additionally, by implementing no-drop policies, the belief was that this would remove the leverage offenders had over the victims to threaten harm unless charges were dropped. The same could be said for mandatory arrests and subpoenas to participate. So as we look at victim services and what started as a movement of women helping women to escape violent relationships over 30 years ago has now evolved into a rules-driven environment where we've implemented policies, procedures, and practices such as curfews within our shelter settings. And with our non-voluntary services, we're seeing things such as mandated parenting classes, chores, and punishment in some regard for not parenting or failing at these services. So when we look at the history of overpowerment, you can see a common theme of systems and sometimes individuals providing services that they feel is best, with little room for error on the part of those who are participating in their services or concern for what the participant feels is best. And like I said earlier, thankfully, we've made some very vast improvements as a society and as, a system of criminal justice. But there is still a lot of work to be done. And so a lot of this conversation regarding empowerment and overpowerment and the examples I've used today are based in advocacy, but the information can be applied in every position that's working alongside individuals, including social workers, housing authorities, healthcare, offender services, and more. So what does overpowerment mean? So here to just define it out, overpowerment is when you're perceived by an individual to have power over them and or others, and you're using that power or that perception of power to make decisions for an individual regardless of what they feel is best. And on the other side, we have empowerment. So this is when we're giving that power to the individual to do something, say something, become stronger, more confident, and have autonomy over their life and claim their rights. So it's the degree of autonomy and self-determination in people and their communities. This enables them to represent their interests in a responsible and self-determined way and acting on their own authority. And so moving into this presentation, there are a few tools that we're going to look over that will be helpful in determining if some of the scenarios that we are put in are scenarios of empowerment or if we're responding more with that overpowerment. So this first one, this is an empowerment scale. This is a scale that I created about a year ago, and this scale is going to help us determine where we're falling on empowerment. So here, in this darker green color, you can see an individual and a system both empower the client. Both are working together to empower the client. We know that this can't always happen, that there are policies, procedures, state statutes, and things that way that we do have to function within. And so here in this lighter green section, we have the individual or the system empower the client within the boundaries set. Here in this yellow section, we have concern of overpowerment from the individual or the system. This orange is the individual or the system are overpowering the client. And then red is when the individual and the system both are overpowering the client. Do we have any questions on the empowerment scale? Pull this up so I can check. Okay. Our next one is going to be the circles of influence. Oh, sorry. So this first circle, this is our circle of control. This is each of us as an individual, and this is what we can control and where we can make an impact through our thoughts, words, and actions. And then as we move onward into the circle of influence, sorry, I'm split screen, so you may see me look over here and then back here. But as we move into the circle of influence, this is where we're gaining and providing knowledge and understanding. This is where we can influence our work environment, our friends, our family, and reputations of ourselves, others, and organizations or systems. And similarly, those things can, will, and do influence us. So the next circle is the circle of concern. So that's this larger circle. And in the circle of concern, this is the wide range of concerns that we may have that we don't have control over. This may include how others behave, politics, sometimes the policies and procedures that we must work under or within. And so sometimes we may see a policy that falls in the yellow or orange sections on the empowerment scale. And this is something that we would have concern over, but we may not have control over. But because of our circles of influence and our circle of control, we can still respond in a way that's still empowering those that we serve. And then here in a few minutes, we're going to look at a few examples. But before we do that, I want to look at this power and control wheel. I think all of us are familiar with the power and control wheel, but this one you'll notice is specific to our response to survivors. So just like that normal power and control wheel that we're used to seeing, which is a tool to understand the extent and experiences survivors have faced in domestic violence relationships. This wheel is looking at the violent and abusive behaviors individuals face when we're working with service providers, organizations, and systems. So still, we have that power and control being the center. We still have these 8 types and tactics moving out to violence and abuse. And so a few examples of this when it relates back to abusive tactics that are mirroring those same tactics used by an abuser. Under intimidation, you may see constant surveillance by the staff. Isolation, we can see curfews may conflict with cultural and family activities. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. You may see accusing survivors of working the system, punishing certain coping mechanisms and survival skills, and then using children, that may be threats to call CPS, DCFS. Mothers punished for using disciplinary methods from their own cultures. Parenting classes also fall under using children. Moving over to privilege, we can see staff does not reflect the population. We can see biases in shelter rules, lack of culturally appropriate food, supplies, and services. I think that I've covered the majority of them, but do we have any questions on any of these spokes on the power and control wheel for service providers? So, as I mentioned, I do work under the rural grant, so I have a few slides in here that are photos that I've taken in rural areas throughout Utah. And anytime we see one of these photos, that's going to be a check-in space. So how are we doing? Do we have any questions on any of these tools or the definitions that we've discussed so far? So as we look at examination, we're going to be reviewing a couple of scenarios to better understand overpowerment and empowerment and kind of putting all of those tools into practice. For these scenarios, I have included both a system-based example and a community-based example. Both examples, as I mentioned before, are more specific to advocacy. So if you are not an advocate, and I know I've seen a few of you, at least online, who were not advocates, just try to put yourself in your advocate shoes. Try to put those on. So our first scenario, we have Jane. And Jane uses she, her pronouns. While meeting with a system-based advocate, Jane states that she does not want to pursue a protective order against John. The advocate informs her that a protective order will offer additional safety, is the only way to keep her safe, and that if she doesn't request a protective order herself, the prosecution will. So Jane agrees to file for a protective order. So how are we feeling about this scenario? If you're online, feel free to throw that in the chat. Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. Let's see how everyone's feeling. If you're in person, feel free to chat about it.
It's like in system-based when you're working in the court system. Sometimes a judge or a prosecutor will oftentimes ask for or issue a pretrial protective order. Even if the victim has signed a waiver, has requested not to have a pretrial protective order issued. And I know that in working with my clients, I've had to kind of balance between letting them know that that's a possibility, that they still have the ability to state that that's not what they want. It's usually on rare occasions that I've had, it's not that it doesn't happen, but it's rare occasions where the victim doesn't want the pretrial protective order and they issue it anyways.
Right.
But in the cases where they have, it's, in my experience, it's typically been where there's concern for witness tampering. And it's the only way that I think the system feels like they can try and address those issues in preventing a destruction of the case.
Right.
But it's a hard conversation because sometimes the victims do want that protection, sometimes they don't. We all know that when you get a protective order and you're triggering that leaving behavior, that triggers the opposite control behavior.
Right.
And there can be a lot of coercion and threats and whatnot. But it's a difficult conversation I have found sometimes to have, and educating your client has been, I think, allowing them to make the best decision possible, kind of safety planning and figuring out, all right, well, what do we do now? What do we do? How do we do this? Has been part of that empowering conversation, empowering that client into what do we do from here if you're not going to have the control to have that.
Yeah. Thank you, Claudia, for sharing. And in the chat, we have coercive, and it's up to Jane. Try not to coerce a client into something they're not willing to do. I would say the word only way to keep her safe is probably where it becomes that coercive, right?
Well, and I think too, the coercive portion too, is like, if you don't do it, it's gonna be done anyway,
Right.
right? And so it's kind of like, oh, well, if I don't have a choice, then I guess let's do it.
Yeah.
You're not really giving a choice, so maybe informing, hey, this is typically what the prosecutor will be doing, right?
Yeah.
It's also an option for you to do it yourself.
Right.
Right, so instead of the coercive tactic of Ashley added, like, I know what's best for you, so this is what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
You guys are doing great, covering a lot of really great stuff. Thank you. In the chat, we also have protective orders are reactive and don't necessarily keep someone safe. They give more options for law enforcement to intervene, but cannot simply stop abuse or danger from happening to a victim. Right. Thank you for sharing. So we've talked about there being some coercive control happening here in this scenario. What types of overpowerment from that power and control wheel can you identify? And I can go back to that if needed. Or as Jane, what types and tactics might Jane feel are being utilized here? We have intimidation here in the chat. Any others? Another one that comes up occasionally when I provide this presentation is threats. And you identified this earlier a little bit, but if you don't do this, it's gonna happen anyways. So some folks identify that as being a threat, as a type or tactic that's being utilized to overpower Jane in this scenario. Which gets into my next question, who is overpowering? And who is empowering? Are both present, just one? What does that look like?
Okay, sorry, I'll let you say it. There you go.
Yeah, I think the system-based advocate is overpowering.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. Does anyone agree or disagree with that? We have some, I agree that the system-based advocate is overpowering. So where is this falling on the empowerment scale for all of you? In the chat, we have the victim advocate is overpowering and maybe placing the victim in danger that they are not aware of. Very possible. So in person is saying orange. Does anyone online want to chat in or unmute? The overpowerment, they are telling them that they have to get it. Yes. Orange, some more folks for orange. And I think the room already kind of keyed into some of those pieces where the prosecutor may ask for a protective order, even if the victim doesn't want that. And they discuss some of those reasons. Additionally, and this may have been mentioned, I just didn't hear it, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating. But another reason they may ask for a protective order is if they're seeing a lot of high risk factors for lethality specifically. So if they're seeing, stalking, strangulation, a lot of those higher risk factors, that might also be a reason that the prosecutor is going to request one of those protective orders. So let's look at this scenario one more time. So we still have Jane being told she needs to file for a protective order. So first, what do we have no control over in this? Yes, I definitely agree. In the chat, we have that could be a reason, but it shouldn't be presented in the way that it was. Absolutely. And we're going to get to that here in just a moment. So here we have the scenario again. What do we have no control over? Filing the protective order by the courts, absolutely. We don't have any control over the response of the prosecutor or the criminal justice system and those policies, procedures, filings, things that way. We don't have control over that. What has influenced us to feel like the scenario is overpowerment? I mean, I just told you the definition of it and gave you some resources, but what are some other influences that we have? Those other influences may be some of our own values, some of our own beliefs, the trainings that we participate in, like trauma-informed care, the trainings that you're all in today, attending SWAVO regularly, core advocacy trainings, the trainings put on by UCASA or RAW. We may also be influenced by our own internal work policies or procedures, and then our experiences. We're all in this field, doing this work every day. We're always learning and growing and presented with new clients, new circumstances, scenarios. Yes, in the chat we have the only way to keep her safe is not necessarily true. Safety planning and protective orders are tools. They're never guarantees, absolutely. So what we do have control over here is our response as the advocate. So as the advocate, what would be a better response here? What would that look like?
Say it louder, sorry.
I think just making sure she has all of the information and knowing what can and what happens if she doesn't file one, but not taking away her choice in the matter. I think we're probably doing the best route to know, because even if she does have a small protection order on it, goes away after a certain amount of time, so. Unless she follows up with it, then it's only for a temporary time most of the time.
I want to piggyback off of what LaFlash said, where it's that information where they're saying, well, prosecution, like there's definitely a better way to state that. I was in that position, for my agency, all of our class A's, PB, assault, automatically, our prosecutor wanted that protective order. And so I was the district court advocate for how to make those phone calls, and so many times where they, before even the question of safety doesn't bring them, I would let them know that it's very common for our prosecutor to request a protective order on domestic violence cases. But we really want to hear from you, what you want to provide any recommendations as what you would like the prosecutor to do on the case. Is there modification? Like if maybe they don't want this protective order because it is going to prohibit communication about the bills, like that's huge. Where can we put a modification in that pretrial protective order and empowering them with the options of what that pretrial protective order may look like, especially if the prosecutor is going to request it despite the victim not wanting it. Letting them know that they have options. They can attend that court hearing at the initial appearance and speak on why they don't want the protective order. There are all these little things that we can provide as empowerment, so that way they're not only making a better decision for themselves, but we're also better informing them of the system and what's available and the tools and the appropriate times that a victim actually has the right to speak to a judge. Definitely for protective order, they have the right to. So that's where we want to highlight that, but not also just saying that's your only option and stopping there. If it is, like, I also would talk about a civil protective order, because we don't know if that protective order is going to stay or not. Maybe that case is going to get dismissed or adjudicated, pretrial protective is on there quickly. So maybe we want to have a conversation that there's this pretrial protective order that can be done, prosecution is over, but there's also civil protective order where you can have a little bit more tangible control of writing in those provisions and having that conversation directly with the attorney and the victim.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing all of that. That was beautiful. And I feel like you know exactly what's on my next slide. But before we jump forward, I just wanted to touch on a couple of reasons why Jade may not want a protective order. Can anyone think of any reasons why Jade may not want a protective order?
Childcare.
Childcare?
They're in the process of a divorce, they need to be able to speak to one another and try and be amicable and trying to discuss divorce issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Any others coming to mind? Financial support in the chat, thank you. Absolutely another one.
Prosecutors were very mindful when they would request a protective order, is that they would say, the city is requesting a protective order, and that was more of a protective factor for the victim, so that way it's not showing like they're the ones requesting it, because that could very much put them in danger, especially if they're not even requesting this protective order. And then this defendant doesn't know that the prosecution has the ability to just do that, and now there's a whole situation of retaliation with family members that are able to communicate.
Absolutely. In the chat, we also have she may be pregnant or have healthcare issues. Maybe the defendant or their children have health or mental health issues. Absolutely. What if Jane has children from a previous relationship with Joe? If Jane now has a protective order, what does that do for custody from that previous relationship? What might that look like?
I mean, is it with a different person? If she has to do different places, I mean, the protection order will affect who she's having a protection order against.
We have in the chat also, Joe can revisit the custody matter.
Yeah.
Maybe file for emergency custody. Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons why Jane may not want a protective order. In the chat, we also have the current and the ex-partner may align. Yeah, great comments, everyone. Thank you.
Michelle, we still love John and wants to be like that. Yep.
So here we have a little bit of a rewrite. So we still have Jane, still using she, her pronouns. And while meeting with a system-based advocate, Jane states that she does not want to pursue a protective order against John. The advocate asks questions to understand Jane's circumstances and sets expectations with Jane regarding the upcoming hearing, while reminding Jane about her victim rights and ability to participate during the hearing. The advocate is going to respect Jane's decision. How do we feel about this one? I think someone in person had kind of covered this a little bit earlier, where we know that the prosecutor may still be requesting that protective order, and we're just going to set that expectation. The prosecutor may be doing this. Here are some reasons why. We're still here to support you. Here are your options. You can be heard. You can do all of these things, and we're here to support you, regardless of what that looks like. We're feeling better about this one in the chat, it looks like. Do you have any comments on this before we move forward? Okay. So with that rewrite, where is that falling on the empowerment scale for all of you?
Go ahead. Was there a comment? Sorry. Oh,
No worries. So where are we falling on this empowerment scale now? Light green, dark green, I think both of those are great answers. It just is going to depend on your perspective of how you interpret this. So we're still working within the boundaries of the system. The prosecutor is still doing their job. They're probably still requesting that protective order, and that's okay. But we're meeting Jane where she is. We're giving that power back to Jane, and we're allowing Jane that level of autonomy over her life. We're allowing her to exercise her rights and make the final decision on her participation, on if she's going to choose to request that protective order or not. We're giving all of that power back to Jane. And so when we are looking at that, what happens with overpowerment? If we are overpowering a victim, they are going to be less likely to participate. They're going to be less likely to seek help in the future, which is going to lead to increased barriers, increased lethality. They are not going to feel as comfortable reaching out for services because we did not value them, their opinions, their decisions, their wants, their needs. We didn't listen to what they were telling us. We overpowered them, and we are doing exactly what their abusive partner does, right? And so when we're empowering a victim or a client, they're going to be more likely to participate. They're going to be more likely to engage in help-seeking behaviors, And we're increasing those feelings of trust and safety, not only with us as someone who does value them, who does listen to them, who does model more positive, healthy relationship skills. They're going to have those increased feelings of trust and safety with us, with our organization, with the system, and how they're interacting with that. So do we have any questions there? How are we feeling about that first scenario? Feeling good? Do we have questions?
Go ahead.
I think, just one thing that pops into my mind is with the what happened there, we've all heard the words, I wish I never would have called the police, I wish I never would have reported, and also like, I'm never calling the police ever again, or I'm never calling for help. And I think those are like, to me, just the hardest words to hear.
Yeah, very difficult to hear that. And sometimes they're not the ones calling. Sometimes that may be a neighbor, and then we're triggering the lethality assessment protocol, and then they end up in the system anyways, and they weren't even the ones that called. So we really need to make sure that we are empowering from the beginning, whether you're that responding law enforcement officer, whether you're the one taking that call from the neighbor, or you're the advocate responding to scene, the advocate on the hotline being connected, being that connection to community-based services. Thank you for highlighting that. All right. Our next example is a community-based
Sorry, one other
scenario.
comment, Katie, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think with the way that things are now, when it comes to domestic violence or assault charges with victims, that even if they aren't the ones, like I know in Colorado, almost anytime there's a domestic violence, there's automatically a protection order and different things that get put in place. I think that kind of hinders victims as well, because then they literally absolutely get that choice taken away, and I think that's kind of hurting victims versus helping them. And I think that's a systemic injustice in my times. It's like some people, they don't want that, but they have no choice. I think that kind of, and there's a lot of things with being able to speak out and wanting to people. That's what they say a lot, is that I don't have a voice and they don't listen to me or whatever. And it's like, well, because it says some things they know, but they know what is best and they just put things in place without actually hearing from the person in the situation. Well, that's not the system. But it's, which is, I mean, it's still part of the system.
It's the law.
So I know that's what I'm saying, it's an hindrance to victims because it does get put on people who have no choice in the matter of regardless. Because as a victim, then you talk to these, you know, stay in that. Like, you know, the judge puts it in effect the moment that if they get bonded out, there's a professional. Yeah. By law. People not listening.
It's, yeah, the law.
But that's the thing that most people say is like, well, they didn't want to listen to what I have to say, they didn't take my opinion into account. And they automatically blame the people that are supposed to be helping them. And that's kind of where we get that bad rap of, you didn't do what you were supposed to do to help me and take my opinion into account. And it's like, my hands are tied just as much as yours.
Sorry if online didn't catch all of it, but essentially it's hard to get with, it is the law, but explaining to the victim, making sure they understand their role is some of the difficulties, and where we're bound by the law, but also trying to make sure they're feeling validated and heard is the balancing act, right?
Yeah,
That's kind of the
absolutely.
gist. They said it more eloquently than me, but.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So this next scenario is a community-based example in a shelter setting. So let's jump into that one. So here we have Jay, and Jay uses they, them pronouns. Jay is a non-binary survivor currently in shelter, and Jay continuously stays out late with friends and family, not returning until after midnight most nights. Staff worries about their safety, but doesn't want to impose a curfew. Jay also struggles to maintain a clean environment and has been known to use substances to cope in the past. One night, Jay returns late and smells of alcohol. Shelter staff threaten to exit Jay if they continue to participate in unfavorable behaviors. How are we feeling about this scenario? Are we feeling good? Do we feel like this is acceptable? This is okay?
Go ahead.
I feel like Jay has a lot of barriers to receive services or to be in shelter. But how we as shelters, right, can we help them manage those barriers? Or put those barriers into manageable, I don't know, pieces, right? Like instead of immediately, hey, like, yes, we have to have rules. We have to keep our shelter safe. We have to keep our other people in shelter safe as well. But there was no threatening, like no violent thing that happened. If it was a violent thing, I could see this immediate, like, hey, let's talk about exit, right? This is what's gonna happen next. If it was a bigger issue, I would say, like a violent thing. But with the barriers, hey, Jay, how can we help you to overcome these things that are going to become barriers for you staying in shelter? Do you need more therapy? Do we need to talk about, whatever? Can we help with the substance abuse classes? Whatever these things are to take away the barriers rather than just immediately find a way to stop Jay from receiving services. If that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. Thank you for sharing that. So oftentimes when we are examining this scenario, a lot of folks jump to that sense of safety for shelter for other clients. Kind of that thought process of they don't want to sacrifice the safety of all for the safety of one. I don't see Jay exhibiting any safety concerns here. So which part of this
Go ahead.
do you all feel would cause a safety concern for the shelter?
Hold on, sorry, we gotta unmute. I'm just gonna get the mic, maybe just stay unmuted.
It will echo if we do. Sorry.
Speak louder and sound. So I think a lot of it comes from the safety issue of curfew. Obviously, I've never come across that. Most of our shelters throughout the state do already have a set where you're supposed to be in. They also have in place. With the drinking, it might not be a safety issue for her, but it might be a traumatic issue for someone else. They might have gone through a traumatic. I just look at it from different point of views. For instance, if somebody actually came in intoxicated, that could hurt for somebody else in that shelter off because maybe they had a traumatic incident. Their partner having to deal with alcohol or drug. So then it is a big safety issue. Sometimes we don't know how people are going to react when it comes to something. Or just a one time, So I don't know. We that was in and we safety there in itself.
But I think there's a big difference between if they smell like alcohol and not beer, and if they come in.
Right. Or they're bringing alcohol into the shelter. Yeah.
you know, I mean, if you go have if you go have a beer with your girlfriends,
Right.
it's not illegal. You know, it's not like a beer when you walk in isn't illegal. So I don't think that would be something to be
Yeah.
even addressed. But I think it becomes stagnated.
Or you got the vodka in your Sprite bottle consistently. Yeah. That's not an exact example. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, like, if Jay is an adult and Jay chooses to cope in those certain ways, I mean, there shouldn't be punishment or judgment for that, as long as, you know, certain, safety, regards are taken into account. As long as he's not falling down the stairs, and we're gonna have an incident report.
Right.
Or something like that.
So
Yeah.
the first comment was a little bit in and out for me, but I think I got the majority of the context. More so, we're concerned with if Jay is coming back to shelter and they are intoxicated, and then they may become belligerent, they may be bringing these substances into the shelter, which would create some access issues, especially if we had like children or someone in recovery in shelter, things of that nature. We may have some concern for other individuals' trauma responses to Jay coming back smelling of alcohol. Is that correct? Is that kind of summarizing everything?
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you. You're fine. Thank you. So I did hear someone highlight they're coming back smelling of alcohol. But is that like, it's not illegal to go out and have a drink with your girlfriends. It's not illegal to go out and have a drink. It's okay for Jay to cope with alcohol. And all of that is also correct. So I can understand where there may be some fear for where we're all coming from, but given this information that we have in front of us, Jay's not posing a threat to anyone in shelter. So there's not a threat right now. So before we jump too far into the weeds with that, can we see any types of overpowerment being used here? And if so, where? What does that overpowerment look like? So we have threat and control of the shelter, threatening Jay to exit them. Absolutely. Great examples. Looks like there's some conversation still happening in person. So Vicky, if you want to just throw in the chat or give me a summary if it is related, that would be awesome.
I think it was just repeating item in the chat.
Awesome.
Here.
Thank you.
I was just curious with, the staff worries about their safety, but doesn't want to impose a curfew. I have never worked at a shelter, so I was just curious about what curfew would look like, if that was possible, if we would have imposed curfew maybe earlier in this conversation. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I think it's a really good point to bring up, because if they would have talked about it in the beginning, hey, there is a curfew, maybe Jay would never have come in late, right? Like, maybe that never would have been an issue, but it sounds like, I don't know if they talked about it in the beginning, let's just say they did, but if there was an issue, talk about it in that moment, rather than waiting for it to become a barrier for Jay to receive shelter, right? So it's finding a way to empower them instead of just, I hold this control over whether you have shelter or not.
Yeah, really great conversation, and I like it. Is there a need for curfew?
Our shelter folks, do you guys want to weigh in?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, like I know that when I worked in shelter, we had exceptions for work. Like if they worked a graveyard shift or things like that, that made, that difference of. But having that, it was for the safety of all residents in the shelter to have the curfew of. That way we can make sure the alarms are set or different things like that, those are some of the safety concerns when you're looking at the overall well-being of everyone in shelter.
I think it's kind of a complicated question because yes, there's a rule that requires curfew. Does that make sense? But if somebody tried to put a curfew on me as an adult, I wouldn't like that. Does that make sense? So the moral, ethical part of it is kind of complicated, but it also makes sense, right? You can know that everybody knows they're supposed to be in by this time, and if someone's not, let's check in, right? There might be a dangerous situation that they might be in. Maybe they don't have a ride back to shelter. It kind of sets off the warning signals, right? Where it's like, hey, this person's not back. They know about curfew. Let's check in and figure out that hopefully they're not in a dangerous situation. But if they are, then we know about it a lot sooner than,
Right.
We found out tomorrow morning, we didn't go through curfew protocol or whatever.
Do most shelters have a curfew protocol? It's been a while since I've been in shelters.
I guess part of the rules of it, it's, it is, and then there's that, just like you said, for the night shifts and like how they work out.
Right.
Yeah, I do think there's a couple that don't.
Are there a couple that don't have curfews? Okay. I was just curious.
Like also modeling like healthy boundaries. Like I now live with my parents and my mom is very much like just freaking text me. Just let me know you're not gonna be home. We've had different traumatic incidences in our home country, so it's just one of those things that like even for me, I still have that like gut reaction of like I don't like this, I don't like the thought of imposing a curfew. But in this place, but I can also see how we would be modeling that help how to have those healthy boundaries and structures in that space.
Yeah, so for me, if my spouse, my husband were to say, Katie, you have to be home at 9 p.m. What would that be an example of? What does that look like?
Right, controlling is what they're saying in the room. Yeah. And I think sometimes it's the communication of the why, right? Essentially, if your husband's like, hey, Katie, can you be home by 9 because I have to go to work and we need someone to take care of our kids, and it's a communication that you're working, that's different, right? Or like with the shelter that we're having the safety, that we're looking at the safety, and this is kind of part of the agreement that while we're helping you be in this safe environment, that this is kind of some of the rules we have to keep in place for everyone's safety. So you're explaining the why to what you're doing. I think a lot of times that helps the victim feel a little better about it too. I don't know.
I think so too. So that may look like, hey, Katie, can you at least check in with shelter by 9 because our secondary staff or our third staff member goes off shift at that time. So we'll have a decreased amount of staff. That way they know that they can check in with you. Maybe they don't have to be back yet because their son has a football game and they know they're not going to be back until like 11. But then you know where they are. You know that they're safe, kind of what they're up to, and you know what to expect when someone comes and knocks on the shelter door at 11 o'clock.
And I think our shelters do a great job of being flexible and meeting the victim where they're at with that.
Yeah, I think so too. So not trying to call anyone out here to clarify.
Yeah, I
just
know
to
you're
make-
not. I think that they have come a long way because it's been years since I've been in it, and I feel like there's a lot more of that. Let's not have this hard rule that we're meeting victims where they're at.
Yes, absolutely. And we always talk about meeting victims where they're at, but not really so much what that actually means, which we'll get to in a few slides. But for the sake of time, let's look at the empowerment scale. So where is this falling on that empowerment scale? We have Jay staying out late with friends and family. We're trying not to impose a curfew. They're coping, coming back smelling of alcohol. We have yellow. We have some concern. We may not know if that's from the individuals or from the shelter policies. We have some more yellow. Yeah, so that's kind of where I fall, is that yellow to orangish range as well. So here in this scenario, we have shelter staff that are overpowering J. They have threatened to impose curfew and exit J. There doesn't seem to be an organizational policy with the limited information we have in this scenario. So there's that concern there for sure. But there may be a policy or something that they are needing to adhere to. So looking at this again, back to the scenario, same scenario. What do we, as the shelter staff, have no control over? We don't have control over Jay's behaviors, Jay's coping skills, or Jay's circumstances, right? So what's influenced us to find this to be a concern for overpowerment? Yeah, we also have that we don't have control over what Jay does when he's not at shelter. We have the client's choices and behavior. Thank you. Again, our control, we control how we respond, the words that we use when we address our concerns, and how we connect Jay to services that they may be interested in. So what could be a better response in this scenario? We've had a few people talk about like the curfew. We've talked a little bit about like maybe we can check in, here are some reasons why. Or just even if we do have that curfew in place, what that looks like as far as setting expectations upon intake. Are there any other responses that we can think of? Speaking about it when they first come in, absolutely. Yeah, so an example could be, hey Jay, I know you're going through a really hard time right now, and it's important for you to maintain connection and support from those that are close to you. I'd love to hear more about your support system. Would you like to share?
We're gonna try a
Then-
different microphone to see if you can hear the comment better. So,
Deal.
go ahead.
I think in a situation like this, there should be policies and procedures laid out in the beginning. I don't think anything should ever be left up to interpretation. Because in this instance, in a shelter situation, you have to make sure everybody in that shelter is safe. You have to have rules that impose that safety and make sure that everybody, knows that. But there's always that situation where someone has certain circumstances where they have to modify it. Trying to control a grown adult and what they do in their life and what choices they make. Yeah, that's hard. But you also have to think of, say, the 50 other people that are in that shelter. Why would you bend the policy and procedure that's gonna protect everybody and not impose it on everybody? When you could modify it for certain people in certain situations, but keeping that base as far as the rules and regulations and saying, hey, if you need something, we're here to help you. We want you to have that choice. We want you to have that freedom. But we also have to think of everybody else. So I think it's kind of conflicting on, everybody thinks that, oh, we're trying to control them. No, we're trying to make it safe. I think there's a big difference in some people's logic and thought where it's like, oh, I'm an adult and I can make my own choices. Yes. But
you have to be considerate of the people you're with in that situation and their safety and their concerns for their families and everything like that. So I think this one's kind of, in my opinion, it's literally right on that line of, are we gonna follow, personal thoughts, or are we gonna follow, what's best for the group? It makes things hard, and that's what makes our job hard, is that we can't do the same thing for every single person. But we can do something that is going to be good for the majority.
Thanks,
Thank
Natasha.
you.
Yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
I think also it's how you look at it with your policy, what your policies and procedure are, and if they're policies or are they, we used to have shelter rules. We now have shelter guidelines.
Yeah.
That way there is that, like we've had people not come back to shelter because they were gonna be late for curfew and they were scared they were gonna get in trouble. And it's like, really? So I think some of that stuff, you really have to, and it also kind of depends on staff. I have to, like when I worked weekends, if you're an hour late, whatever, you're an hour late, I was still gonna be awake anyway, so, but then I have other staff that's like, she was 15 minutes late, so it's kind of personalities and that kind of stuff as well. But I do think, at least the way our shelter is laid out and the people coming and going, I think if someone is coming in at, an hour past curfew, that's not putting everybody else in our shelter at risk, because of the layout and, whatever. I think something like that is okay. But I do like the way we've kind of changed over the years, and instead of having rules, we have guidelines. I do think that makes it a lot easier conversation to have with people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. Those are really great perspectives. And it is very hard to kind of walk this line between empowerment and overpowerment while still functioning within those boundaries we have set for us as shelter rules or guidelines, and things that way. And so some things that we may say instead are, hey Jay, I know you're going through a hard time right now. I know it's very important for you to maintain connection and support from those that are close to you. I'd love to hear more about your support system. Would you like to share? That's going to help us build rapport, but also help Jay feel like they can still have that connection with their support system, which is going to be helpful in them as they navigate their current circumstances. Another thing that we can do following up with that is, I care about you and your safety. Would you feel comfortable giving me a heads up when you're going to be out late so I'm not worried that something has happened? That feels a lot better than, if you're here late, then we're going to give you a curfew. And then if you break curfew, we're going to exit you and then you can't access these services. We want to learn more from Jay. We want to build that rapport, build that relationship, and create that sense of safety. Or the scenario also mentions that Jay is having a hard time cleaning up after lunch or cleaning up. And so maybe we're just talking to Jay and saying, hey, would you like to chat while we clean up after lunch? I'd love to learn more about you. I'd love to learn more about how I can support you. I know what you're going through is a lot for one person to carry and navigate on their own. How are you doing? How are you holding up? Would you be interested in learning more about how we can support you, as well as the other resources available to you in the community? Those are still addressing all of our concerns for safety and our current policies, but we're doing so in a way that's more empowering and inviting Jay in to share, rather than kind of forcing Jay to share, forcing Jay to become defensive, kind of forcing those trauma responses from Jay. We're inviting Jay in. We're building that rapport. We're building a relationship with Jay where they feel safe in shelter, along with everybody else in shelter, because we're also addressing the concerns that we have. So here's a bit of a rewrite of the scenario. Still Jay Jay, as a non-binary survivor currently in shelter, Jay continuously stays out late, connecting with their support system. Staff worries about their safety when they stay out late. Because Jay has used substances to cope in the past and has struggled to maintain a clean environment, staff are concerned about Jay's mental and emotional health. Shelter staff continuously offer support to Jay by connecting on a deeper level, checking in, and helping Jay as they clean up. How does this feel? We have in the chat that this feels way better. One thing that stands out to me is on this rewrite, where we still have the same scenario, nothing has changed. But you can see in the writing that the perspective has shifted of the individual writing this. So instead of having a lot of negative connotations of the behaviors Jay was exhibiting, now we're looking at this as in a more positive lens, as Jay's staying out there, connecting with their support system. We're worried about their safety. Jay's used substances in the past. Jay's struggling to maintain a clean environment. We're concerned for their mental and emotional health. We want to connect more. We want to build that relationship, and we're going to support them in any way we can, including helping them clean up after themselves. We're going to help them clean up after lunch. So some of it is also just our perspective shifting. You have any thoughts here on this rewrite? One other thing that I was going to mention here is when we're creating rules, policies, or procedures, our intention is generally to address an issue that has occurred. When we do this, we may be causing more harm than good over a single instance that took place. We may have a shelter rule in place that, the kitchen's locked after 9 p.m. because 25 years ago, someone ate all of the food in the fridge after coming from a very food insecure home. And it cost us a lot of money, but that happened 25 years ago, but the kitchen's still locked after 9 p.m. There's locks on the fridge. So maybe we can revisit some of those rules, some of those policies and procedures that we've put in place and really understand, was this just a one-off occurrence? Is this something that continuously happens? What can we do with this policy or procedure to be more empowering for survivors? Because I also know that having a lock on doors or a fridge or cupboards, that may also be traumatizing and triggering for survivors as well. That may also make them not feel safe. The other thing I wanted to ask here is if we were to still terminate services, if we were to still exit J, does that alleviate any of our concern that we have for J? Probably not. Now we just don't have connection with J. And where is J going to go? J has a couple options. J may be homeless. J may return to their partner. Or in the moment, they're going to have to figure something out. So with this rewrite, our perspective shifting here, where does that fall on the empowerment scale?
Eric, can unmute. Okay. We are saying light green. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
The reason I would say light green as opposed to dark green is it's kind of like, it is still within the boundaries, right? I think what's been interesting to me on both scenarios is that they're not really big changes. It's more like, these are just slight changes, like as far as communication and how you approach the individual and the problem or the issue while empowering them. So you're not, it's not like someone is saying, hey, Jay, I'll come and pick you up so you get home safely. Or, nobody's really like extending the limits of what the shelters, workers can actually do. But we're kind of just like scaling it back to bring back that autonomy. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We also have dark green in the chat. I really like that you mentioned that these are doable things for everyone. I really tried to make sure that what I was offering all of you was something that you all had control over, something you all could do. I'm not asking you to go back and try to change all your policies and procedures and review them. I'm not asking you to go to legislators and try to change laws or go to our state or federal funders and try to change any of those guidelines. These are just how we respond. These are things that we have control over. These are, yeah, in the comment or in the chat, we have tone matters. So these are all things that we can do. Perfect. Thank you all for sharing. I still have a few more questions because I'm a very informal presenter and I also don't know everything. And so it's really nice to hear from all of you so that I can also learn and grow and improve the content that I'm providing. And so here, I wanted to look at this more from your perspectives. So what's going to happen if we continue to overpower Jay, or if we're going to empower Jay? How is this going to change the relationship between you as the shelter staff and Jay as the client? How's that relationship going to change? In scenario 1 versus scenario 2.
I think trying to overpower someone.
Oh, I don't think it's.
Really. Sorry, I'm just probably not talking about it. I was gonna say, overpowering someone's ability to probably make them feel like they did in the situation they were before. It could cause a lot more conflict, it could cause a lot more internal troubles, especially with mental health. So I think empowering someone and just setting those guidelines rather than strict rules, allowing them to have their choice and everything that's going to allow them to say, hey, I can open up to you, I can talk to you, I can, let you know what my problems are. But by giving them those strict, you have to follow this, you have to do this, you have to do that, it's gonna be like, no, I don't. And they're gonna possibly, fight back in some way, not technically physical, but they could rebel in a way or, not want to do what he said. I think making it to where they feel like they have their choice back is always going to help in any situation when dealing with someone who's been in a trauma-filled relationship, and it's going to help them open up to you and ask for help more, rather than think that they can handle it on their own and not be able to deal with their problems.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to give that back to them. When you look at the two scenarios, either from the system-based or the community-based example, how does that overpowerment feel for you? Does it feel good? Does it feel icky, gross? How does overpowerment feel? Feels gross. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I agree. It doesn't feel great. It does feel kind of gross and icky and not fun. But how does empowerment feel? Great. Yeah. It might also feel scary to let go of some of that power, some of that we have. Because we are in this work, we do know the resources, we know what's available, and sometimes people don't want to access that, so that feels scary. It's okay to acknowledge that. In the chat, we also have supportive. Empowerment also feels more trauma informed, absolutely. And I think one thing that comes up for me when we're looking at the difference between empowerment and overpowerment, and this was kind of touched on a bit in one of the comments earlier, but when we're overpowering and we're maintaining a level of that control, people may get defensive. They may exhibit some of those trauma responses, and those can change over time. They're really important to keep, forefront of our mind when we're working with these survivors. For me, my trauma response, 15 years ago, I used to fawn. I was going to do whatever I needed to make sure you were not mad at me, you were not disappointed in me. That was my trauma response. But now my trauma response is more to fight. And so if you're telling me I can't do something, like, we can fight about it if you want to. Like, we can throw hands, but don't actually try to throw hands with me. I'm only like 5 feet tall, okay? Like, I'm just gonna, no, we can talk about it though. So keeping that in mind, that when we are doing this, the way we respond, whether that's empowerment or overpowerment, we may also see some of those trauma responses, because I know I'm not the only person with a fight trauma response. I'm not the only one who's had or has a fawn trauma response. And then we're also looking at flight, freeze. Those are also trauma responses that we may see if we're overpowering and mimicking some of those same behaviors that the abuser has. So in the second scenario with Jay, how might that feel if you were Jay, experiencing, that first scenario compared to the second scenario?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it would feel, like you're going from one controlling situation to another. Right? So if it's the overpowerment, are we trying to empower them to learn healthy relationships, and that it's not okay to have control over someone else in a relationship? Or do we want to teach them that someone's always going to have control over you? Right? So
Yeah, thank you. Feels like being kicked while you're down. Thank you for sharing that in the chat as well. And if you're an organization leader, how would it feel seeing these two scenarios kind of side by side, whether that is the system-based or the community-based? How would it feel seeing those maybe as, an incident report, maybe for victim services commission, if there's, something coming up there, they feel like rights are violated or something along those lines? How would you feel as that organization leader? And seeing that show up on your desk? Oh, lots of conversation. Thank you all for sharing. It's been really great. But just quick check-in. How are we feeling? Are we doing good? We have questions? Having some thumbs up. Awesome. So we will go to this next slide. So we talked about meeting people where they are earlier today, and meeting someone where they are means that we are bridging the gap between our own expectations and where the other person is actually coming from. That means that we are intentionally listening to understand their values, their needs, their desires, and even their trauma responses. So we're here to meet Jane with Jane's values, needs, desires, and trauma responses. We're meeting Jay with Jay's values, needs, desires, and trauma responses. Not mine, not each of ours. We're going to leave those at the door. I know sometimes the things that we have in our personal lives, in our work lives, all the things that are going on in the world, those are going to kind of play a role in that. And we're going to bring those to work with us sometimes. And so here is a self check-in that you can do. So this is the emotion wheel. This is a check-in tool that I've used with a few of my teams over my career. And so really quickly, you don't have to share out loud, but just take some time to reflect personally. What are some emotions that you're feeling? What did you bring with you today? How did you feel at the beginning of the day? What emotions were those? Why were you feeling that way? How might those feelings that you brought to work with you today affect the work that you can do today? And then what can you do about that? And how can you improve or change the outcome? So if you came to work today and you were feeling, disrespected or embarrassed or insignificant, how might that play a role in the work that you're able to do today? And what can you do about that? In a previous organization, I was program manager, and when I would do this with my staff and they did that self-reflection, we would do this before we went to implement direct services, specifically with youth. And so when we would do that and we would do the self-check-in, sometimes my staff would tell me, I can't do this section today. I can't do these pieces today, or I will be kind of background support for you. Can you take the lead? Because I'm not in the best headspace. Can you fill in for me? And that's okay. It's okay to ask for help. And it's only going to benefit the survivors that you're working with. So once you've completed your self-check-in, the next piece is looking at connection. So who are you going to check in on or connect with today? So maybe we're checking in on and connecting with Jay. Maybe that's part of that cleaning up after lunch, learning about their support system, things of that nature. But who are you checking in on or connecting with today? And the second is, what expectations of normal am I letting go of today? Is it okay that your clients aren't participating 100%? Is it okay if they're late for their appointment? Is it okay if they need to leave early? Or if they're so excited or upset, they're louder than normal or louder than we think they should be? So what expectations of normal am I going to let go of today? And then this last question, what am I creating, cultivating, or inviting in today? So again, if I'm feeling annoyed, disrespected, inadequate, what environment am I likely creating during client appointments or with meetings with community partners, with coworkers? What does that look like? And I do have this in a worksheet format. So if you would like that, I can share that in the chat when I'm done. And then just really quick, any questions from anyone? I know we've had a lot of discussion, but has there been anything come up that you'd like to chat about more? I think we have like 3 minutes left. Perfect. I'll share that handout in the chat in just a moment. Okay. Thank you. And here's my contact information, my email, my phone. Feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have questions that you want to chat through more one-on-one, if you want to have more conversation, anything that way, you're more than welcome to reach out to me in either space.
Thank you so much, Katie. Always a pleasure to have you, but thank you for your time.
Of course. And then I also have an evaluation that I would love for you all to fill out. Give me some honest feedback if this was helpful for you, if you loved it, if you hated it. I would love to learn more. So I will plug
Yep.
that in the chat, that handout, and that's all that I have for you today.
Thanks, Katie. We appreciate you. Okay, we'll take a break until 2:45. Everyone stretch, maybe get some fresh air. And for those online, you guys take care of yourself as well. We'll come back at 2:45.